Welcome back to the deep dive. Think about a place, maybe one that's incredibly beautiful, but also remote, maybe even a bit unforgiving. So much so that it almost seems to push people away. It resists permanent settlement, turns away hopeful pioneers for literally thousands of years.
Yeah, I know the kind of place you mean. A destination, maybe, but not really a home.
Exactly. We're talking about a landscape that drew visitors, adventurers, sure, treasure seekers, but historically, nobody stayed for long.
And that right there is the story of Baja California Sur, BCS. It's a fascinating premise.
It really is.
So for our deep dive today, we're digging into that paradox. How could a place with, a 50,000-year human history remain almost empty until, basically yesterday in historical terms?
Yeah, that's our mission today. We want to get a handle on the history of BCS through its population, specifically this difference between migration, people coming, looking for something, and then leaving, versus sustained immigration.
Right, the kind that builds communities over generations.
Yeah, we're looking at demographics, history, even genetics, to figure out what finally tipped the scales for settlement and maybe what that whole long history means for the culture there now.
And the sources, they show this really clear pattern. Arrival and then retreat. It keeps happening.
So the main idea is that BCS was always this transient spot.
Largely, yes, because nature itself was, you could say, its toughest gatekeeper.
Okay, let's talk about those really, really early numbers, because the time scale here is just immense. Yeah. We're talking indigenous presence going back potentially more than 50,000 years.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around 50 millennia.
Right, but then you look at the population estimates, and they're tiny.
That's the first big puzzle of Baja. The analyses we've looked at suggest at its peak, maybe only about 1,000 indigenous people across the entire peninsula.
1,000 people spread across, nearly 800 miles?
Yeah, roughly 775 miles long. It's an incredibly low density, especially for land that's been occupied for so long.
It makes the more recent numbers seem almost crowded in comparison, even though they were small too. Like 1975, just under 50 years ago, BCS had only about 75,000 people.
75,000! Think about that. Fewer people than fill a decent-sized football stadium.
Spread across an area bigger than Switzerland. So what kept the numbers down for all that time? What was going on?
Well, the big factors were always the environmental ones. It's easy to just say harsh climate, but it's more specific.
Like the lack of water.
Definitely the lack of reliable water, especially away from the coast.
Yeah.
BCS is remote. It doesn't have major river systems running through it like other places.
Okay.
So the indigenous groups who live there, like the Killua, the Pariku, they had to adapt. And that mostly meant a migratory lifestyle.
Moving around a lot.
Yeah, generally moving north or sticking very close to coastal resources where, fishing and shellfish were possible.
So the land itself just didn't really allow for big permanent settlements like you saw in, say, central Mexico.
Pretty much. It forced a kind of nomadism. To build a large, stable village, you need reliable water inland, you need agriculture that works year after year, supply lines.
Things that just weren't readily available there.
Exactly. Add in the droughts. The sheer difficulty of moving across that rugged terrain, it was a natural barrier. And that defined the population story for, almost its entire history.
And this pattern, this sort of transient life, it didn't stop with the indigenous peoples, did it? It kind of continued when outsiders started showing up.
No, it absolutely continued. And first, of course, we have to acknowledge those foundational groups. The Killua, Pariku, Guayacura, Paipai, Kumeyaay, Cochimi, Kukapas.
Right. The original inhabitants.
And the sources also mention others like the Seri and Yaqui, who seem to have been migratory visitors too. So that reinforces the pattern movement rather than deep settlement.
Okay, so then the Spanish arrive. They try to impose their system, the mission system. But it sounds like they hit the same walls.
They really did. They ran right into those same huge logistical problems. The mission system is famous, across the Americas. But in BCS, it wasn't exactly a success story in terms of population building.
More like a really tough assignment. How many people are we actually talking about with the Jesuit effort?
This number is actually kind of shocking. The sources suggest the total number of Jesuits involved across the entire Baja mission period was only 56.
56 total for that entire peninsula.
56 individuals trying to establish missions, convert people, build communities in that vast, dry landscape.
Wow. That sounds less like colonization and more like, an extreme expedition.
It kind of was, and besides the obvious lack of water, they faced other massive problems.
Like disease,
Exactly. They brought European diseases, which absolutely devastated the already small indigenous populations they relied on.
So the very people they needed for labor and local knowledge were disappearing.
Right. As that local knowledge base vanished or scattered, the missions became even more isolated, these tiny, unsustainable outposts. They introduced some things, sure, building techniques, new crops maybe, but
ultimately they failed to create that permanent growing population base.
they didn't flourish, no. They became another layer of history, another part of that story of arrival and eventually departure, another lesson in how not to survive long-term in BCS, in a way.
Which leads us right to the big question then. If 50,000 years of history, plus the Spanish Empire, couldn't really crack it, what changed? Because BCS is thriving now, population-wise.
Something definitely broke that cycle, and the data points pretty clearly to a tipping point.
When was that?
Numerically, it looks like it happened around the 1970s, maybe stretching into the early 1980s. That's the window.
Okay, the 70s. So if everyone before indigenous groups, Jesuits, early families, adventurers, if they all struggled or left, what was different about the people who arrived then? What did they have?
Two big things, really. Infrastructure and technology, or maybe the application of technology.
Infrastructure, like roads.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The completion of the Trans-Peninsular Highway, Mexico Federal Highway 1, right through the 70s. That was absolutely critical.
Okay. So a reliable way to move stuff.
For the first time, really. A physical artery. Before that, moving anything substantial, like building materials or heavy equipment, was a nightmare.
So you could finally bring things in reliably, even if you couldn't produce everything there.
Precisely. And the people who came then, figures like the Espinosas, who were key in developing La Paz, for example, they weren't just showing up hoping for the best. They were ambitious, resourceful. They were actively solving the problems that had stumped people for centuries.
Can you give some examples? What kind of problems were they solving? What were they building?
Well, think about building in remote areas with zero existing utilities. No power grid, no municipal water, nothing.
Right. Starting from scratch.
Completely. So they had to figure out how to transport massive amounts of resources. They developed specialized construction for the desert, climate managing, cooling, even heating sometimes. They had to create systems for fuel storage, making sure fuel stayed clean, which is a big deal in dusty, remote places.
And water. That must have still been the biggest challenge.
Huge. They implemented water purification systems, and later, crucially, desalination technology started to become more feasible. They improved agriculture where possible. They were literally engineering a habitable environment.
So they weren't just surviving, they were actively building comfort and sustainability.
Yeah.
Building on all those past lessons, even the failures.
Yes. It was this combination, the new highway access plus this wave of really determined, ingenious people applying technology that finally allowed BCS to flourish in terms of population.
And that history, that whole story of struggle and eventual success, you can kind of see it everywhere there now, right? The ancient cave paintings, the old mission ruins, but also the modern ranches and towns.
It's all part of the cultural landscape, this understanding of survival, of finally making it work.
In this story of arrivals, departures, and finally finding a way to stay, it connects to the broader picture of Mexico's identity, doesn't it? Particularly the genetic side.
Absolutely. The complex history of who came to BCS, from ancient peoples to those 1970s pioneers, it mirrors the incredibly diverse genetic makeup of Mexico as a whole.
Yeah, people outside Mexico sometimes have a very simplified view, but the reality is this deep, complex melting pot. What does the DNA actually show us?
Well, it shows that diversity and mixing are the defining features. You hear the term mestizo a lot, right?
Right, meaning mixed race.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that mix is predominantly white European and indigenous American, of course, but there's also a significant Asian component.
Asian. That's maybe less commonly known. Where does that come from?
A lot of it traces back centuries, actually, to things like the Manila Galleon trade. These Spanish trading ships connected Asia, particularly the Philippines, directly with Mexico's Pacific coast for over 250 years.
Wow. So people from the Philippines, China, other parts of East Asia, they were part of that network and integrated into the population way back then.
Correct. The DNA reflects that global maritime history. And it doesn't stop there.
What else is in the mix?
Well, if you look at mitochondrial DNA, the maternal lines, you find African haplogroups L1 and L2 specifically. These primarily entered the gene pool through the historical slave trade, with Africans arriving on both the Pacific and Caribbean coasts.
So we're really talking indigenous founders, Europeans, Asians, Africans.
And others too. Pacific Islanders show up, Afro-Mexicans have distinct communities, East Asians beyond the galleon trade, Middle Eastern groups, Jewish communities. It's a true mosaic.
It sounds like Mexico's genetic makeup is just as diverse, if not more so, than places like the U.S. or Canada.
It's very comparable in its complexity, absolutely. It's a population shaped by waves of global migration meeting indigenous roots. And that inherent diversity, that mixed heritage, is arguably part of the resilience, part of what fueled the resourceful people who finally unlocked BCS's potential. It wasn't just local ingenuity in the 70s, it was the culmination of these global histories converging.
Okay, so we started with this picture of Baja California Sur as a place that for tens of thousands of years just wouldn't let people settle down permanently.
Yeah.
A land of migration, of failed attempts.
Yeah, a really long history of struggle against the elements. But we end with its modern success story. This shift in the 1970s, driven by ambitious people using infrastructure and technology.
Building on every single lesson learned before, including all the ways not to do things.
Exactly. They finally figured out the formula for sustained growth in that unique environment.
And all that accumulated knowledge, going way back to the indigenous peoples who understood the land's rhythms, through the Jesuits who left their mark, couldn't stay, it creates this really deep foundation, doesn't it?
It really does. It makes you think maybe there's this kind of intelligence or knowledge embedded in the place itself, in the land, the sea, the sky.
Something you can feel.
Maybe when you're out there, away from the resorts, maybe in the wilder parts, or visiting an old ranch or pueblo, you kind of sense that history. You're seeing the result of all those survival stories, all that adaptation.
The resilience needed to make a life there.
Yeah.
It's literally baked into the culture, maybe even the DNA.
Yeah. So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. Next time you encounter a place that seems remote or harsh or difficult, think about its hidden history. What stories of failure and adaptation are buried there?
And what spark of ingenuity might be needed to finally unlock its potential, turning that long history of struggle into a story of success. Makes you think.